Let's return to discussing the events at sea during the American Civil War. In previous episodes, we've looked at the technological level of the various navies. We've seen the first measures taken, the Northerners, the naval blockade, and the Southerners starting to issue letters of marque to privateers. But today, I want to talk to you about something very important, the blockade runners. In fact, the southern states did not have a secondary sector. They needed to import goods useful for the war effort from Europe while waiting to achieve self-sufficiency to establish a secondary sector, but that required time and money, two things the Confederate States did not have. The enemy was at the gates, and they had to find another way to cope, namely by purchasing from abroad. But with the naval blockade, everything became more difficult. The Confederate States didn't even have the means to build commercial ships, so they had to rely on private initiative to purchase and bring in ammunition, long guns, handguns, personal weapons, and cannons. And the person who saw the opportunity to do business was a certain George Terhome. He was the manager of Fraser and Company, a trading firm with offices at ports in Liverpool, New York, and Charleston. Terhome was a Southerner, originally from Charleston, and he decided to help his country in some way while also making a bit of money for himself, which never hurts. First of all, Fraser and Co. offered itself to the Confederate government to act as a crucial clearinghouse for Confederate credit, meaning it effectively acted as a sort of central bank in its vital relation to the various European states. It diligently issued letters of credit, provided essential guarantees through this influential bank. So thanks to this very important company, the Confederates were ultimately able to obtain much needed credit from European banks and successfully managed to purchase the various crucial goods they desperately needed for their war efforts. But Theron did even more. He offered to load one of his merchant ships in England with various military supplies and to bring it to Confederate ports, breaking through the Union blockade, which at the start of the war was quite lax. So this ship arrived. It was called the Bermuda, the first blockade runner that was carrying military supplies purchased by the Confederate government with its own money. In addition, there was another part of the cargo, again consisting of weapons purchased independently by Fraser and Company, which they then resold to the Southern government, and that was where Theron made a huge profit. But it didn't end there, because later this Bermuda in southern ports would load almost 2,000 bales of cotton, which it would then manage to bring to England and sell at a very high price, because obviously with the ongoing blockade, the persistent demand for raw cotton in England remained absolutely constant, but there was a significantly much higher risk that this valuable cotton would be intercepted. So consequently, it was sold for a staggering 5 to 6 times the original price it was initially bought for in the Confederate States, where instead there was a great abundance of readily available cotton that simply couldn't be sold precisely because of the effective blockade and the critical lack of merchant ships. Previously, numerous northern merchant ships would regularly come to pick up the essential cotton, but now they were completely gone, so there was a real and significant opportunity to make truly huge profits. Anglo-Confederate companies began to rapidly spring up, formed by enterprising people from the south of England who started actively buying ships and engaging in this highly lucrative trade. In England, they would buy weapons, arrive at southern ports, sell the weapons to the government, and in exchange load bales of cotton, which they would then resell in Europe. This went on up to a certain point because, as we'll see, at a certain stage of the war, things changed a bit. But at the beginning, there was really a lot of profit to be made. Also, keep in mind that in Europe, the English and French textile industries were in desperate need of Confederate cotton for their factories, which otherwise risked shutting down for a long period. However, in the end, they managed to find other secondary markets as well, like Egypt and India, but southern cotton was always more sought after. It also cost less under the same conditions, so there was always a high demand for it. On the other hand, the planters wanted to sell their cotton and were even willing to accept low selling prices. However, the methods of the blockade runners began to change somewhat after the first months of the war. First of all, there was an embargo imposed by the Southerners in the summer of 1861, meaning that some politicians, some journalists, and some economists began to say that in order to obtain international recognition of the Confederacy from France and England, it was necessary to force their hand, that is, to stop selling them cotton, in order to compel them to recognize this new state. Precisely for the reasons I mentioned earlier, because of the needs of the industries, which otherwise risk shutting down the European industries. And so the southern government never actually passed a law to that effect, but it did approve this approach, and thus a sort of moral pressure was created on the planters not to sell cotton abroad. And obviously some people still sold it anyway, but in my opinion this is worth remembering because it would become a major problem for the South. In my view, it was a big mistake not to sell all the available cotton, to seize everything that was available and sell it in Europe. At that time, when the naval blockade was not yet so tight for the southern states, they could have accumulated money, they could have stockpiled all the necessary war materials, without creating market distortions or problems that, as we will see, actually arose when everything was left to the private initiative of blockade runners who acted in their own interest, not that of the Confederate state. This is important to remember beyond the somewhat romantic images of those red butlers from Gone with the Wind bringing goods to the Confederacy. In reality, as we will see, they were mainly looking out for their own profits. So at the beginning, we see this reckless decision which will create major problems for the South's war supplies. Then, fortunately, in 1862, the Southerners realized a bit of their mistake. They saw that this embargo had not brought any results, also because some private individuals still managed to sell cotton through neutral ports in the Caribbean islands. England and France, in fact, never recognized the Confederacy except as a belligerent, partly because they also had large reserves of cotton from 1860. So the Southerners were also unlucky. They picked a bad year to try to ship cotton. In any case, we will see that the Southerners understood that cotton was their sole wealth. They had little hard currency, little silver, little gold in their coffers. Almost all the gold and silver was in the banks, and the Confederate States certainly didn't want to give it up. So, to get credit, to get money, they absolutely had to sell their cotton. And in 1861, aside from this embargo, the Confederate States still purchased about 400,000 bales of cotton in the so-called productivity loan. That is the producers, the southern planters, sold agricultural goods to the Confederacy, to the Confederate government, so it was almost all cotton, in exchange for receiving treasury bonds that allowed them later on to be reimbursed the amount with a certain percentage of interest, or they could use these sums owed to them by the Confederate government to reduce their taxes, but only in the long term. At that time, however, the Confederate States built up a large stockpile of bales of cotton, which they would later use. We'll see how. Meanwhile, the operating methods of the blockade runners had also changed. In fact, they no longer departed from England to go directly to southern ports, but instead made stopovers in neutral ports such as Bermuda, Nassau in the Bahamas, or Havana, Cuba. This was very useful, first of all, because the first part of the journey was completely safe, since large merchant ships could load a great quantity of goods without fear of being intercepted by the Union forces. If Union ships did intercept them, they were neutral English ships carrying goods to neutral ports, so they couldn't be seized. Do you remember the Declaration of Paris of 1856, which provided for exactly this? Then from these intermediate bases, the Confederate ports were only 2 or 3 days sailing away. From there, blockade runners would set out on fast ships, pick up war materials, take them to southern ports, and then leave again, once more breaking the blockade loaded with cotton to bring back to these neutral ports, which became real trading hubs where there were agents of the Confederate government, agents from individual states, various merchants, and so these ports truly became filled with blockade runners who would gather all this material. It's also important to note that the blockade runners' ships themselves began to change, adapting to their new mission. In fact, at first, during the early months, sailing ships and passenger transport vessels were used, where the passenger seats had been removed to create more space. Well, starting from 1862, since blockade running had become a true commercial enterprise, ships were specifically built for this purpose in Scotland, the so-called Clyde ships, or even in Liverpool, modeled after the Banshee, which was famous for this. A famous blockade runner, the first transoceanic runner built in steel. This was the main characteristic of these new ships built specifically for blockade running. They had a metal hull that was strong yet lightweight, which made the ship less heavy overall. The ship had a remarkably aerodynamic shape, featuring a narrow stern and a slightly wider bow, but always maintaining a sharply pointed prow. This design was crucial because these innovative ships were no longer like the old sailing vessels that merely rode over the waves. Instead, they were engineered to powerfully cut through them, slicing the water to gain significant speed and, importantly, not waste precious time, let's say, by riding those big rolling swells. So, what exactly were these advanced vessels? They were, in essence, ships propelled by powerful steam engines. They still thoughtfully retained masts with sails, intended for use as a crucial backup in case the primary engines ever broke down unexpectedly. However, their main and most impressive speed came directly from the robust steam engines, and the method of propulsion wasn't by a traditional screw propeller, but rather by two prominent side wheels, much like the familiar paddle steamers seen on the mighty Mississippi River. This particular design choice was made because in the often shallow waters where they operated, these large wheels worked considerably better and made maneuvering the ship significantly easier. These specialized ships also had everything deliberately lowered. The cabins, for instance, were built very low to the deck, precisely to make them as inconspicuous and difficult to spot as possible. Even the tall smokestacks and the masts for the emergency sails were ingeniously retractable, designed to be telescopic, meaning they could be collapsed and hidden away to avoid being spotted by vigilant Union lookouts at sea. Another very important and crucial thing was that precisely to avoid being easily noticed or detected, these vessels burned high-quality anthracite coal, which inherently produced a distinctive white smoke, so it was significantly less visible and much harder to spot compared to black smoke. Furthermore, these formidable ships were meticulously painted in specific colors to effectively camouflage them, such as a deep dark gray or a light sandy color, in short, all of them. All these ideas were useful to improve the performance of these blockade runners, which I remind you were not armed. They relied entirely on speed and, of course, on the skill of the pilots, who were all Southerners, who knew the coasts well. This was a very important thing to remember. In fact, the Union surveillance was mainly focused on the ports. I recall quite clearly that the main Confederate ports were Galveston, in the state of Texas, New Orleans, Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, and Mobile, indeed, in Alabama. Very soon, of course, the characteristic of the southern ports was that they had bays with several channels for entering and exiting, the possibility to defend these ports with fortifications, small forts equipped with large cannons, the famous Brook guns, the cannons I mentioned in previous episodes, rifled cannons capable of sweeping kilometers of coastline and even the sea to cover the arrival or escape of blockade runners. And then there had to be railway infrastructure to transport the acquired materials to the battlefields and to bring other agricultural resources to be traded. As I was saying earlier, the Northerners monitored these ports. There was a first ring of small ships that kept watch right along the shoreline, especially at night. Then during the day they would leave because otherwise they would be hit by artillery. Then there were ships, old sailing vessels, in short, somewhat less modern ships that stayed a few kilometers out. Offshore there were perhaps also gunboats, maybe in the ports where there were also southern gunboats. And then farther out at sea, there were the faster ships that could chase down the blockade runners. So the blockade runners had to try to find the right moment, which was always at night, perhaps taking advantage of the tides or even storms and wind. In short, any weather conditions that could distract the enemy and instead allow experienced sailors and pilots who knew the seabed and could prevent the ships from running aground to enter friendly ports. For example, I'll mention the port of Wilmington in North Carolina, which from the middle of the war onward would become the main port for blockade runners. It was a small town, but then it would become a sort of Las Vegas because these sailors would arrive there with lots of money, wanting to spend it on women and revelry. The distinctive feature of this port of Wilmington is that it has this river, the Cape Fear River, which then flowed into the ocean through two different channels. This was important because the Union fleet that was patrolling had to split up between these two channels, and the blockade runners could choose whichever was more favorable to them. Then there were many small forts, the most famous being Fort Fisher, which guarded the entrance to this harbor, so it was an excellent port that also had an adjacent railway network. The blockade runners were also very skilled and adept at employing various clever tricks. Thank you. For example, when a blockade runner was initially spotted, the Northerners would promptly fire signal rockets, and then, in response, the Southerners might also strategically fire their own rockets to effectively deceive the enemy from a completely different and unexpected direction. Meanwhile, this gave the blockade runner the chance to enter or leave the friendly port. Or I can also mention the episode of the blockade runner Robert Lee, one of the runners owned by the Confederate government's War Department, because at a certain point, even the Navy and War Departments would acquire their own blockade runners precisely to increase the arrival of war materials. So this Robert Lee, this blockade runner, at a certain point sailed right through the enemy ships, flying the Union flag. This wasn't unusual because many blockade running ships were later captured and then reused to patrol the coasts. So this ship passed through the enemy vessels and once it arrived, hoisted the Confederate flag. Just to give you an idea, this anecdote and the blockade runners, it's estimated that there were about 350 ships that were used to break the blockade, and there were thousands and thousands of attempts to run the blockade. It's estimated that about 70% were successful. So overall, a good percentage. Clearly, that's an average over all 4 years of the war. Just one trip was enough to make huge profits. The costs were covered, and you could earn double what you had invested. On average, blockade running ships made 3 or 4 trips before being either captured or sunk. However, there were some ships that managed to make more than 30 successful runs. Just imagine how much profit that brought to their owners and also to their crews. The crews were composed of sailors who were not exclusively Southerners. In fact, a significant number of them actually came from England. Despite the explicit ban imposed by the British government on its own citizens from getting involved in this particular conflict. It was important to be a foreigner because if you were captured by the Unionists, you would be released immediately, whereas if you were a Confederate citizen, you would be arrested and treated as a prisoner. I want to clarify this point. Despite Lincoln's threats to treat Confederate privateers as pirates, meaning to hang them, in short, blockade runners were almost like privateers. However, even though Lincoln's government never recognized the Confederate States, Southern prisoners were always considered prisoners of war and thus were imprisoned and not executed as rebels. This is something very important and crucial to always remember, especially for those Southern prisoners. I also want to specifically mention something that, in my considered opinion, very clearly explains the remarkably high success rate of the blockade runners. Apart from the beginning, when there were only a few ships, very soon, by the end of 1861, the Northerners could already deploy over 140 ships to patrol the southern ports. By the very end of the devastating war, there would ultimately be as many as 600 impressive ships, either meticulously built in the bustling northern shipyards or successfully captured by the powerful Northern Navy. These included former swift privateer ships or former agile blockade runners, all contributing significantly to their naval strength. In my considered opinion, this other percentage was primarily due to the undeniable fact that if a northern ship successfully captured a blockade runner, it would invariably receive a substantial and lucrative reward from the subsequent sale of the valuable cargo it was diligently carrying, which could potentially be crucial weapons or numerous bales of raw cotton, and also, quite importantly, from the outright sale or official confiscation of the vessel itself, which would then be efficiently and strategically reused by the Northern Fleet. That's why the captains of the patrol warships didn't open fire. The blockade runners were always eager to chase after them at first, but by doing so, considering that the ships breaking the blockade, especially from the middle of the war onward, were extremely fast vessels, built specifically for this purpose, reaching speeds of 16 to 17 knots, they were hard to pursue, weren't they? And so, in practice, by trying to capture them, the Union ships actually helped them escape. If instead they had relentlessly bombarded them, remember, the blockade runners were completely unarmed and utterly couldn't fight back at all, by aggressively shelling these vulnerable ships, they might have successfully managed to stop them. But of course, the ship would have inevitably sunk along with its valuable cargo, so there would have been absolutely no financial gain whatsoever from such an action. So in a very significant way, the inherent greed of the northern sailors actually helped many of the daring blockade runners to successfully escape. So on the surface, at first glance, it all seems perfectly fine. Many blockade runners were actively operating, managing to consistently succeed, bringing in truly vast quantities of essential supplies. But that's not really the complete case, because there were indeed some significant underlying problems that needed to be addressed. In fact, since they were private individuals, they brought in whatever suited their personal preferences. They mostly transported valuable luxury goods because those items took up very little space, you see, and were highly profitable. Hats from Paris, silk stockings, fine wines, champagne. These took up little space and were worth a lot, whereas bringing in weapons, bombs, grenades was first of all very dangerous if you were caught or chased by the Unionists, and they also took up a lot of space. It was a risk that blockade runners didn't always want to take on, and so we see that these men, despite the aura of romanticism that surrounded the captains of these ships, didn't really deserve it. In reality, they were people very interested in money, who cared little about the fate of the Confederacy and who also created major problems, since they were the only lifeline keeping the Confederacy connected to Europe and to European supplies. They created distortions in the internal market of the Confederates. In fact, it got to the point where luxury goods were easier to consume and could be found at a not excessive price compared to necessities like flour or sugar. Let me give you this example. Let's say that at the start of the war, to make a cake, I, as a southern citizen, needed 1 hectogram of coffee and 4 hectograms of flour. I would pay $1 for a hectogram of coffee and $1 for 4 hectograms of flour. So with $2, I had the ingredients to make my cake. When the blockade began, let's suppose that logically the prices of all goods increased. Because they had to be transported by these blockade runners, there was a risk involved, and you also had to pay for insurance. So let's assume that every type of good increased by $1 per hectogram. So when I went to buy my coffee, I no longer paid $1 per hectogram, but I had to pay $2. Whereas for my 4 substantial hectograms of flour, I no longer paid merely $1, I had to pay a significantly higher amount, specifically $5. So we clearly see that this essential good, a fundamental necessity, experienced a much greater and more substantial price increase compared to a luxury good, which typically sees less dramatic fluctuations. And that's what happened. Basically, in the Confederacy, it was easier to find luxury goods that cost more, but not that much more than before, rather than to find everyday goods. This was because blockade runners preferred to bring, for example, coffee in smaller quantities, since they could get a lot of dollars for it, rather than bring large quantities of, say, flour, which was cheap and required transporting a lot. This led to a bit of an upheaval in the markets and to inflation, not only due to this effect called the Red Butler effect, but also because the Confederacy printed a lot of paper money. It also depended somewhat on the ability to substitute certain goods, but certainly this Red Butler effect created many problems for the poor, especially in the southern states, who did not have money for luxury goods even before nor during the war, but now found it increasingly difficult even to get basic necessities. To better explain this, let us look at this diagram I made for you. On the y-axis, we have a necessity good, let us say flour, and on the x-axis, a more luxurious good, coffee. We have this diagonal line representing the budget constraint, that is, the income available to all citizens of the Confederacy to buy different quantities or baskets of coffee or flour. We are simplifying with a little model, of course. When did the Confederate people reach maximum satisfaction? When, with this budget constraint, they touched these C-shaped curves, which are utility curves representing baskets of these two goods that gave the consumer the same satisfaction. So with that budget constraint, I could just touch the highest curve at point P0. Here, there was a combination of quantities of good Y and good X that guaranteed the greatest satisfaction for the Confederate population. With the rebuttler effect, that is, with the increase in prices due to risk, the rationing of transportation, and imports by blockade runners, you can see that the oblique line shifts toward the center because the real purchasing power of this income decreases. I can buy fewer products, but not only that, the line is also shifted toward the center of the Cartesian axis. There is also a noticeable change in the slope, which is due to the red button effect, leading to the different proportional increase in the prices of certain goods compared to others. And so we see that with the new line, there is a new point, let's call it point 1, where it is tangent to a utility curve that is clearly at a lower level, lower, providing less satisfaction compared to the previous curve at point P0. However, even here, utility is maximized with the available real income, real meaning how many goods I can actually buy with that money. We see that there is a new quantity of goods consumed in the Confederate market, quantity Y1 and quantity X1. From this very simple diagram, what do we observe? With the increase in prices with the red Butler effect, both goods, flour and coffee, are consumed less in the internal Confederate market, but the decrease is much more pronounced for flour, the staple good, which, as you can see, has a segment from Y0 to Y1 that is much longer compared to the reduction from X0 to X1. This is precisely because they were consumed in proportion. It was easier to find and consume luxury goods compared to staple goods.